The desert air still carried the cool bite of night as the first light of dawn crept over the Mojave, painting the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base in shades of amber and rose. Captain Victoria, Hawk Calloway had stood on flight lines like this one 100 times, but today she stood a little longer, a little stiller, her gloved hand resting against the fuselage of the F-35 Lightning II, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. At 29, she had already lived several lifetimes in the sky, and she carried every one of them in the quiet set of her jaw. Her calloused fingers lingered on the insignia painted beneath the cockpit where her call sign, Hawk, was emblazoned in bold letters alongside the American flag. The morning desert breeze tugged at her flight suit as she stared at the aircraft that had become more home to her than any place with four walls and a roof. "Going to miss her, Captain." The voice belonged to Chief Master Sergeant Donahue, who had been maintaining Victoria's aircraft since her first day at Edwards. "More than I can say, Chief." Victoria turned, the rising sun catching in her amber eyes. "She's the closest thing to freedom I've ever known." "Well, she'll be waiting for you when you get back." The older man handed her a small box. "Cleared out your locker already. Thought you might want this before you ship out to your mother's place." Victoria accepted the box with a nod of thanks, her throat suddenly tight with emotion she wouldn't permit herself to display. Chief Donahue had been like a second father to her since she'd arrived at Edwards, since her real father couldn't be there anymore. Back in her sparse quarters, Victoria placed the box on her standard-issue bed and opened it carefully. Inside, preserved in perfect military precision, lay her father's old flight suit. Colonel Robert Eagle Calloway had been a legend in the Air Force, one of the elite Thunderbird pilots who had pushed the F-16 Fighting Falcon to its absolute limits in displays of aerial mastery that had inspired a generation of pilots, including his daughter. Victoria lifted the flight suit, the fabric worn but immaculately preserved. The faint scent of her father still clung to it somehow, a mixture of aftershave and that indefinable smell of high altitude and jet fuel that seemed embedded in the very fibers. Her fingers traced the embroidered Thunderbird patch on the shoulder and the name tape that read Calloway across the chest. Tomorrow marked 3 years since Colonel Calloway had flown his final mission. 3 years since he had made the ultimate sacrifice that few civilians would ever understand or appreciate. 3 years of Victoria carrying his legacy in the cockpit of aircraft, even more advanced than he had ever flown. As she held the flight suit against her chest, her eyes fell on the letter that had arrived yesterday. The one from her mother, Margaret Calloway Harding, now remarried to a kind insurance salesman named Frank, who had never quite understood Victoria's drive to follow in her father's footsteps. The letter was a reminder of the promise Victoria had made before her last deployment: to spend time at home, to give civilian life one more chance before committing to her next military assignment. Her mother had moved to a new town after remarrying, seeking a fresh start away from the air bases and military communities that held too many memories. Victoria would be starting at Westridge High School tomorrow to complete her civilian education requirements, a strange prospect for someone who had spent the last few years flying at Mach 1.6 and pulling 9G turns that would render most people unconscious. Just one semester, she murmured to herself, remembering her promise. One semester of pretending to be a normal teenager before making her final decision about accepting the elite tactical training post she'd been offered. Another item in the box caught her attention: her father's aviator sunglasses, the ones he had worn on his final, triumphant show with the Thunderbirds before returning to combat duty. She unfolded them carefully and slid them onto her face, staring at her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. For just a moment, she saw her father looking back at her, the same determined set to the jaw, the same slight furrow between the brows. A sudden impulse seized her, Tomorrow wasn't just her first day at a new school. It was the anniversary of her father's sacrifice. The day deserved to be honored, not hidden away. She made her decision in that moment, a decision that would set in motion events she could never have anticipated. Tomorrow, she would wear her father's flight suit to school. Not her own modern one that would raise too many questions, but his Thunderbird suit. It would be her private tribute, a way to feel close to him on a day when the distance between them seemed most unbearable. What Victoria couldn't know was that this decision would change everything. Because sometimes, a simple act of remembrance becomes something far more profound when witnessed by those who don't understand its meaning. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Victoria awoke in her new bedroom at her mother's house. The room felt alien, decorated with touches that were meant to make it feel like a typical teenage girl's room, but missing all the things that actually mattered to her: aviation manuals, model aircraft, and the technical journals she studied religiously. She slipped out of bed and quietly retrieved her father's flight suit from where she had carefully hung it the night before. Her mother and stepfather were still asleep, unaware of her plans. Victoria knew they wouldn't approve, would worry about her drawing attention to herself on her first day, but some things were more important than blending in. She dressed with the practiced efficiency of military routine, each movement precise and economical. The flight suit was slightly large on her slender frame, but she rolled the sleeves carefully and adjusted it until it looked presentable. Last came her father's old dog tags, which she tucked beneath the collar, the metal cool against her skin. When she came downstairs, her mother was in the kitchen making coffee. Margaret froze when she saw her daughter, coffee pot suspended in midair. "Vicky," she said carefully, setting down the pot, "what are you doing?" "You know what day it is, Mom." Victoria's voice was gentle but firm. Her mother's eyes softened with pain and understanding. "Of course I do. I think about him every day, not just on anniversaries." "I need to do this," Victoria said simply, "just today." Margaret looked like she wanted to argue, but something in her daughter's expression stopped her. Instead, she stepped forward and adjusted the collar of the flight suit with the familiar gesture of a military spouse who had done this countless times before. "Your father would be so proud of you," she whispered, "so proud of the pilot you've become." "I'm not just doing this for him," Victoria admitted. "I'm doing it for me too." Her stepfather Frank entered the kitchen then, stopping short when he saw Victoria's attire. Unlike her mother, he had no frame of reference for military life, and his discomfort was evident. "Don't you think this might make things harder for you?" he asked tentatively. "First days are tough enough without." "Without honoring my father's memory," Victoria finished for him, more sharply than she'd intended. Frank raised his hands in surrender. "I just want things to go well for you, Vicky. This is a fresh start." What neither of them knew was that Victoria had received another letter yesterday, this one delivered directly to her at the base. A letter from the Air Force Academy regarding her application. She had kept it to herself, not ready to discuss its contents or its implications for her future. That letter now rested in the breast pocket of her father's flight suit, close to her heart as she prepared to navigate the unfamiliar territory of civilian teenage life. The yellow school bus rumbled to a stop at the corner of Maple and 3rd, its brakes releasing a tired hiss as the doors folded open. Victoria Calloway stood at the designated stop, her father's flight suit a jarring contrast to the casual attire of the other students waiting nearby. A few curious glances had already morphed into outright stares, but Victoria maintained the straight-backed posture that had been ingrained in her since childhood. She boarded the bus with military precision, nodding a brief thanks to the driver. The conversations that had been buzzing throughout the vehicle died down as heads turned to track her progress down the aisle. Victoria scanned for an empty seat with the same focused attention she would give to scanning the horizon from a cockpit. What is she wearing? Is that a Halloween costume? Maybe it's for Spirit Week. No, that looks real. The whispered comments followed her like contrails as she found an empty seat near the middle of the bus. She sat down, back straight, eyes forward, the way her father had taught her to face any challenging situation. Posture reflects confidence, Vicky, he'd always said. And in the air or on the ground, confidence keeps you alive. A girl in the seat across the aisle leaned over, her expertly applied makeup and designer clothes marking her as someone who cared deeply about appearance and social standing. "You must be new," the girl said, her voice carrying a false sweetness that Victoria recognized immediately. "I'm Brittany Lawson. You might want to know that costume day isn't until next month." Victoria turned to meet the girl's gaze directly. "It's not a costume." Brittany's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "So you're actually in the military. Aren't you a little young?" "This was my father's," Victoria replied simply, offering no further explanation. Brittany seemed thrown by the response but recovered quickly. "Well, it's definitely a bold choice for a first day." She pulled out her phone and, pretending to check a message, snapped a quick photo of Victoria. By the time the bus pulled into the parking lot of Westridge High School, Victoria knew that her image would already be circulating through social media, likely with mocking captions and emoji reactions. It didn't bother her. After facing enemy fire in training exercises and pulling G-forces that would make most people black out, teenage ridicule seemed like a minor inconvenience. The school building loomed before her, a sprawling two-story brick structure that had none of the utilitarian efficiency of military facilities. Students milled around the entrance, forming their social clusters with the instinctive tribal gathering that seemed universal to high schools everywhere. As Victoria descended from the bus, the conversations around her faltered once again. Near the front steps, a group of Letterman jacket-wearing athletes had congregated around a tall, broad-shouldered young man whose confident stance marked him as their leader. Brandon Garrett, the school's star quarterback, noticed Victoria immediately. His eyes traveled from her combat boots to the Thunderbird patch on her shoulder, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. "Check out G.I. Jane," he called loud enough for nearby students to hear. "I think she took Dress for Success a little too seriously." His friends laughed on cue, several of them pulling out phones to document the moment. Victoria kept walking, her face impassive. She had learned long ago that reaction only encouraged targeting, whether from enemy combatants or high school bullies. As she approached the main entrance, she became aware of an older man watching her from the doorway. Tall and lean, with the unmistakable bearing of military service, he observed her with an intensity that was different from the curious or mocking stares of the students. When their eyes met briefly, something like recognition flashed across his weathered face. Inside, the hallways buzzed with pre-class activity. Victoria consulted the schedule she'd been mailed, locating her assigned locker with the systematic approach she applied to all new environments. As she worked the combination lock, she could feel the weight of attention pressing in from all sides. Smartphones appeared in peripheral vision, capturing her image from various angles as students passed by with poorly concealed interest. "You've got everyone talking already." Victoria turned to find a slight young man leaning against the adjacent locker. Unlike the others, he wasn't holding a phone and didn't seem to be mocking her. "Not my intention," she replied, stowing her backpack in the locker with precise movements. "I'm Danny Park," he offered, "local science nerd and aviation enthusiast." He nodded toward the Thunderbird patch on her shoulder. "That's from the Air Force Demonstration Squadron, right? My dad works in aerospace engineering. I recognize the emblem. For the first time since arriving, Victoria felt a small release of tension. That's right, my father was with the Thunderbirds. Before Danny could respond, the first period bell rang, sending students scurrying toward classrooms. Victoria checked her schedule again. Room 237, Colonel Harrison, Military History, she read aloud. Danny's eyes widened slightly. You've got Harrison first period. That's either really good luck or really bad luck, depending on how much you actually know about military history. He was Air Force before he started teaching, and he doesn't tolerate any BS. Thanks for the warning, Victoria said, offering the first genuine smile since she'd arrived. As she walked away, she didn't notice the tall figure of Colonel Frank Harrison watching her from the end of the hall, his eyes fixed on the name tape across the back of her flight suit. Calloway. The military history classroom was arranged in precise rows, unlike the casual clusters of desks in other classrooms Victoria had passed. Colonel Harrison stood at the front, his posture military perfect despite the civilian clothes he wore. His hair was cut in a high-end tight style that hadn't changed since his service days, and his penetrating gaze assessed each student who entered as if they were reporting for inspection. When Victoria entered, his eyes locked onto her immediately. A flicker of something unreadable passed across his face before his expression returned to neutral. He gave her a slight nod, directing her to an empty desk near the front. As the final bell rang, Colonel Harrison closed the classroom door with a decisive click and turned to face the assembled students. "Welcome to military history," he began, his voice carrying the unmistakable command presence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "For those who are new, I'm Colonel Frank Harrison, United States Air Force, retired. I expect punctuality, preparedness, and participation in this classroom." His eyes scanned the room before settling on Victoria. "I see we have a new addition today. Since you've chosen to make a visual statement with your attire, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself to the class." Every head turned toward Victoria. She rose to her feet, standing at parade rest out of ingrained habit. "Captain Victoria Calloway, sir," she said clearly and then caught herself. "That is, I'm Victoria Calloway, recently transferred." A murmur ran through the classroom at her instinctive military response. Colonel Harrison raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on her slip. "And would you care to explain your choice of attire to your classmates, Ms. Calloway?" Victoria met his gaze steadily. "This flight suit belonged to my father, Colonel Robert Calloway. Today is significant to my family. Wearing it is my way of honoring him." "The Thunderbirds," Colonel Harrison noted, gesturing to the patch on her shoulder. "Your father flew with the Air Demonstration Squadron." "Yes, sir. F-16 Fighting Falcon. He was later assigned to the 58th Fighter Squadron at Eglin." A boy near the back raised his hand. "So, was your dad in Top Gun or something?" A few students snickered. Colonel Harrison fixed the boy with a stern look. "Top Gun is Navy, Mr. Palmer. The Thunderbirds are Air Force. They represent the absolute pinnacle of tactical aviation skill." He turned back to Victoria. "The F-16 is a formidable aircraft. Perhaps you could tell us some of its capabilities." It was a test, and Victoria knew it. She straightened slightly. "The F-16 Fighting Falcon is a fourth-generation multi-role fighter with a top speed of Mach 2, or approximately 1,500 miles per hour at altitude. It can pull 9G maneuvers, has a ceiling of 50,000 feet, and can carry a variety of air-to-air and air-to-ground weapon systems. The Thunderbird modified versions retain all combat capabilities while adding specialized smoke generation systems and custom paint schemes." The classroom had gone completely silent. Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment. "Impressive knowledge, Ms. Calloway. I wonder, could you explain to the class what it means when a pilot pulls 9GS? It means the pilot experiences forces equivalent to 9 times normal gravity," Victoria explained, falling naturally into the instructional tone she'd used during her own training days. At 9GS, a 10-pound object effectively weighs 90 pounds. For pilots, blood is forced away from the brain toward the lower extremities, which can cause loss of vision and consciousness if not counteracted. Pilots wear G-suits that compress the lower body to keep blood in the upper body and brain, and they perform specific breathing and muscle tensing techniques called the AGSM, or anti-G straining maneuver, to maintain consciousness. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. "And how much training does it take before a pilot can handle such forces?" "Extensive centrifuge training and years of gradual exposure," Victoria said, then added without thinking, "It took me about 6 months before I could consistently handle 8GS without graying out." The moment the words left her mouth, she realized her mistake. A confused murmur spread through the classroom. "Wait, did she just say she's a pilot? Is she making this up? No way she's actually flown jets." Colonel Harrison raised a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. There was something in his expression now, something like recognition mixed with careful restraint. "Thank you, Ms. Calloway," he said. "That was most educational. Please take your seat." As Victoria sat down, she could feel the entire class staring at her, their initial amusement now mixed with confusion, and from some, outright disbelief. She kept her eyes forward, maintaining the composed expression that had served her well during countless flight reviews and debriefings. Colonel Harrison smoothly transitioned into his planned lecture on the development of air power in the 20th century, but Victoria noticed that he kept glancing at her, his gaze thoughtful and assessing. When he discussed the evolution of fighter aircraft, his technical descriptions were more detailed than would be typical for a high school class, as if he were speaking directly to her. Danny Park, seated 2 rows over, was watching her with undisguised fascination. When their eyes met briefly, he gave her a subtle thumbs up, apparently impressed by her knowledge rather than skeptical of it. As the bell rang ending first period, Colonel Harrison called out, "Ms. Calloway, a moment of your time, please." Victoria approached his desk as the other students filed out, many of them casting curious glances back at her. When the room had emptied, Colonel Harrison spoke in a lower, more conversational tone. "Calloway," he said, studying her face. "Any relation to Robert Eagle Calloway of the 58th? Victoria felt a jolt of surprise. "He was my father, sir." The older man nodded slowly. "I thought I recognized the name. Your father was a hell of a pilot, one of the best I ever saw in the air." He paused, a shadow crossing his features. "I was sorry to hear about his final mission. He saved a lot of lives that day." "You knew him?" Victoria asked, suddenly hungry for any connection to her father. "We crossed paths several times during my career," Harrison said. "Never served in the same unit, but the tactical aviation community is small." He studied her with new interest. "But you said captain when you first introduced yourself. That wasn't just a slip of the tongue, was it?" Victoria hesitated, then straightened. "No, sir. I'm currently on leave from Edwards Air Force Base, test pilot program." Colonel Harrison leaned back, genuine surprise showing on his face. "You're an actual Air Force test pilot, at your age." "I received my commission through an accelerated program," Victoria explained. "My flight aptitude scores were unusual. The Air Force made accommodations." "What are you flying?" The question came with the eager interest of one pilot to another. F-35 Lightning II, sir. I've been part of the Advanced Tactical Systems Integration testing. Harrison let out a low whistle. Fifth generation, stealth, integrated avionics, that's the cutting edge. He paused, his expression growing more serious. So why are you here, Captain? Why Westridge High School instead of the cockpit? I made a promise to my mother, Victoria said simply, to give civilian life one more chance before my next assignment, to complete my formal education requirements. And the flight suit today. 3-year anniversary of my father's last mission, sir. It seemed appropriate. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. I understand the sentiment, but you should know that your choice of attire has already made you a target for certain elements of the student body. Teenagers can be less disciplined than a squadron of pilots when it comes to respecting what they don't understand. I'm aware, sir, it's just for today. Very well. He wrote out a pass for her next class. I look forward to having you in my class, Captain Calloway. It's not often I get a student who truly understands what it means to pull 9GS. As Victoria left the classroom, she felt a strange mix of emotions. It was unexpected to find someone who had known her father, who understood the world she came from. But Harrison had also confirmed what she already knew would happen. Today she had made herself visible, and visibility often came at a price. The morning passed in a blur of introductory classes, each following a similar pattern. Teachers would notice her unusual attire, sometimes asking about it, sometimes choosing to ignore it. Students would stare, whisper, or take surreptitious photos when they thought she wasn't looking. By the time the lunch bell rang, Victoria's image had spread throughout the school's social networks, accompanied by increasingly creative speculations about who she was and why she was dressed in a flight suit. The cafeteria at Westridge High was a sprawling space with the chaotic energy of a military mess hall during deployment rotation, but none of the organization. Students self-segregated into clearly defined social territories, their boundaries invisible but rigidly enforced. Victoria collected a tray of food and surveyed the room with the tactical awareness that had been drilled into her since childhood. Finding an unoccupied table near the far wall, she sat down with her back to the wall, instinctively positioning herself with clear sightlines to all entrances and exits. She removed a folded letter from the breast pocket of her flight suit, the Air Force Academy seal visible on the letterhead. This was the third time she had read it since it arrived, but the words still sent a thrill of pride through her. Dear Captain Calloway, it began. We are pleased to inform you that your application for Advanced Tactical Aviation Leadership has been accepted. Given your exceptional service record and the recommendation of your commanding officer, we are prepared to offer you a position in the next training cycle. The letter represented everything she had worked for, confirmation that her path forward would honor her father's legacy while establishing her own. And yet, she had promised her mother one semester of normal civilian life, one chance to see if she could find purpose outside of the cockpit. Is anyone sitting here? Victoria looked up to find Danny Park standing by her table, lunch tray in hand. She quickly folded the letter and returned it to her pocket. No, feel free, she said, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. Danny sat down with a grateful smile. Thanks. The cafeteria social hierarchy is pretty rigid around here. New kids usually end up eating in the bathroom their first week. I appreciate the warning, Victoria replied, finding herself genuinely appreciative of his straightforward manner. So, Danny said, taking a bite of his sandwich, that was pretty impressive in Harrison's class. You really know your aircraft. Victoria shrugged slightly. I grew up around planes. Because of your dad, the Thunderbird pilot. Yes, she said simply. not yet ready to reveal the full truth to someone she had just met. Before Danny could ask another question, a shadow fell across their table. Victoria looked up to find Brittany Lawson standing there, flanked by two other girls wearing similarly expensive outfits and expressions of practiced disdain. Behind them, Brandon Garrett and several other athletes watched with amused interest. "Mind if we join you?" Brittany asked with artificial politeness. "We wanted to meet Westridge's newest celebrity." Without waiting for a response, Brittany slid into the seat beside Victoria while her friends took positions around the table. Danny tensed visibly but remained silent. "So," Brittany continued, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of nearby tables, "what's with the costume? Are you doing some kind of performance art thing, or is this a cry for attention?" "It's a uniform, not a costume," Victoria replied calmly. "Right," Brittany drawled. "A real military uniform, because they totally let high school students fly fighter jets." Brandon Garrett approached the table, his confident swagger drawing eyes from across the cafeteria. "Maybe she's practicing for the school play," he suggested, generating laughs from his friends. "Or maybe she's one of those military cosplay people. My cousin's into that stuff, dressing up like they're soldiers when they've never served a day." Victoria felt a flash of anger at the casual disrespect, but kept her expression neutral. "This uniform belonged to my father. He was a pilot with the Air Force Thunderbirds demonstration team." "Wow, impressive," Brittany said, her tone making it clear she didn't believe a word. "And does your dad know you've raided his closet for school fashion?" "My father died 3 years ago today," Victoria said quietly. "He gave his life in service to this country." A brief, uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Even Brittany seemed momentarily thrown by the response. But Brandon recovered quickly, his discomfort shifting into a more aggressive stance. "That's convenient," he said. "Claim your dad was some kind of hero, wear his uniform, and we're all supposed to just believe it." Danny spoke up for the first time. "Maybe you should back off, Brandon." "Stay out of this, Park," Brandon snapped. "No one asked the science nerd to weigh in." Victoria felt the familiar calm descend over her, the same focused clarity she experienced during high-stress flight maneuvers. "I don't need you to believe anything," she said evenly. "My father's service and sacrifice aren't diminished by your ignorance about them." Brittany's eyes narrowed at the subtle rebuke. "Listen, new girl, I'm trying to help you out here. This costume stunt might have worked for attention at your old school, but at Westridge, it just makes you look desperate and weird." "Noted," Victoria replied, her tone military neutral. "So what's with all the pilot talk in Harrison's class?" Brandon pressed. "You trying to convince everyone you fly jets too? What are you, like 17? 18, Victoria corrected automatically. "Whatever. The point is, nobody's buying this whole military brat routine. If you want to fit in here, you might want to try dressing normal and not making up stories about G-forces and fighter planes." Victoria studied him with the same analytical attention she would give to an approaching aircraft on her radar. "I appreciate your concern for my social integration," she said, her formal phrasing a deliberate contrast to his casual dismissal. "But I didn't come here to fit in." "Then why did you come here?" Brittany demanded. "I made a promise," Victoria said simply, rising from her seat. "Now if you'll excuse me." As she picked up her tray, Brandon stepped into her path. "You know what I think? I think you're just playing dress-up. Probably watched Top Gun too many times and now you're pretending to be something you're not." Victoria met his gaze steadily. "You're entitled to your opinion." "So prove me wrong," Brandon challenged. "Tell us something only a real pilot would know." Danny interrupted again. She already did that in Harrison's class. You weren't there. Shut up, Park, Brandon said without looking at him. Well, Calloway, got any pilot secrets to share? Victoria considered for a moment, then decided to offer one small truth, a story she rarely shared. My call sign is Hawk, she said. I got it after my second solo flight in an F-35. I was performing a low-altitude systems check when an actual Hawk collided with my aircraft. Took out one of my sensors. Most pilots would have aborted the mission immediately, but I completed the test profile and brought the aircraft back with minimal damage. My commanding officer said I was either as stubborn as a hawk or as lucky as one to survive the impact intact. For a brief moment, genuine interest flickered across Brandon's face, quickly replaced by skepticism. Nice story, but you expect us to believe you've actually flown military jets? No, Victoria replied honestly. I don't expect you to believe anything about me. Your belief or disbelief doesn't change the reality of who I am or what I've done. With that, she sidestepped him smoothly and walked away, leaving her lunch largely untouched. Danny scrambled to gather his things and follow her. That was impressive, he said when he caught up to her in the hallway. Most people just crumble when Brittany and Brandon target them. I've faced worse pressure situations, Victoria said, then added with a small smile, pulling 8GS while maintaining weapons lock tends to put high school drama in perspective. Danny stopped walking and stared at her. Wait, you weren't kidding in class. You've actually flown fighter jets, for real. Victoria hesitated, then gave a slight nod. That's classified, she said, her tone softened by the hint of humor in her eyes. Danny laughed, thinking she was joking, but there was a new respect in his gaze. You're different, he said finally. I mean that as a compliment. Thanks, Victoria replied, I think. The afternoon brought physical education, a class Victoria had been dreading since receiving her schedule. Not because of the physical demands. Any civilian PE class would be trivial compared to her military training, but because it would mean changing clothes, potentially revealing her identity as more than just a student wearing her father's flight suit. Coach Patterson, a broad-shouldered woman with a perpetual whistle around her neck, eyed Victoria's attire with clear disapproval as students filed into the gymnasium. Calloway, she called out, my office now. In the small, trophy-lined office adjacent to the gym, Coach Patterson crossed her arms and looked Victoria up and down. I don't know what other teachers have let you get away with today, but you can't participate in PE wearing that. You need proper athletic attire. I understand, Coach, Victoria said respectfully. I have a change of clothes, but I'd prefer to sit out today's activities and observe instead. That's not how my class works, Coach Patterson said firmly. Everyone participates, no exceptions. Change into your gym clothes and join the rest of the class in 5 minutes. Victoria weighed her options quickly. She could comply and risk exposing more of her identity than she wanted, or she could refuse and create an unnecessary conflict. Neither option was ideal. Coach, she tried again, today is a significant anniversary for my family. This flight suit belonged to my father, who died 3 years ago today. I wore it to honor his memory. I'd prefer not to change out of it for just this one class period. Coach Patterson's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry about your father, Calloway, but rules are rules. Either change for class or I'll have to mark you absent. I understand, Victoria said, making her decision. I'll accept the absence. The coach's eyebrows rose in surprise. That will affect your grade. I'm aware, ma'am. Coach Patterson studied her for a long moment, seeming to reassess the composed young woman standing before her. You're not what I expected from reading your transfer file, she said finally. Most teenagers would have just complained or made a scene. "I'm not most teenagers," Victoria replied simply. "No, I don't think you are." The coach checked her clipboard. "Tell you what, since it's your first day, I'll let you observe, but tomorrow you participate like everyone else. Deal?" "Thank you, coach. I appreciate it." Back in the gymnasium, the class had divided into teams for a volleyball tournament. Victoria took a seat on the bleachers, relieved to have avoided both changing out of her father's flight suit and creating an unnecessary confrontation. Her relief was short-lived, however, as Brandon Garrett and several of his teammates approached, having apparently chosen this moment to take a water break. "Look who's sitting out," Brandon called. "Guess fighter pilots don't do volleyball, huh?" Victoria kept her expression neutral. "Coach's decision, not mine." "Right. I bet you asked to sit out because you didn't want to mess up Daddy's costume." "Flight suit," Victoria corrected reflexively. "Whatever." Brandon took a long drink from his water bottle, then looked at her with a calculating expression. "You know, if you really are some kind of military kid, you should be in pretty good shape, right? All that training and discipline and stuff." "Physical fitness is a core requirement for military service," Victoria acknowledged cautiously. Brandon grinned, and something in his expression told Victoria that she had walked into some kind of trap. "Then you wouldn't mind proving it, since you're not playing volleyball anyway." "What did you have in mind?" she asked, though she was already regretting engaging with him. "The rope," Brandon said, pointing to a thick climbing rope that hung from the ceiling at the far end of the gym. "Coach makes us do it for fitness tests. Record is held by yours truly at 8.5 seconds to the top. Think you can beat that, pilot?" Students nearby had stopped their games to listen, sensing the challenge in Brandon's voice. Victoria knew she should decline, should avoid drawing more attention to herself, but something in the dismissive way he said "pilot" rankled her military pride. "I don't need to prove anything to you," she said evenly. "Exactly what someone would say if they couldn't back up their claims," Brandon replied with a smirk. "That's what I thought." The implied accusation of dishonesty struck a nerve. Integrity was the first core value instilled in every Air Force cadet. Integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. Before she could reconsider, Victoria found herself on her feet. "One climb," she said, walking toward the rope. Coach Patterson, noticing the gathering crowd, blew her whistle. "What's going on over there?" "Just showing Calloway the climbing rope, coach," Brandon called back innocently. "She's agreed to demonstrate proper technique," one of his friends added with a poorly concealed snicker. The coach looked skeptical but nodded. "All right, but make it quick. We're in the middle of a tournament." Students gathered around the climbing rope, excitement building at the prospect of the new girl being humiliated. Victoria approached the rope and tested its thickness, automatically calculating weight-bearing capacity and friction factors. "Timer starts when your feet leave the ground," Brandon explained, pulling out his phone to serve as a stopwatch. "You need to ring the bell at the top." Victoria looked up at the ceiling, estimating the height at approximately 20 feet. A trivial climb compared to the emergency egress drills she had mastered during flight training. "Whenever you're ready, new girl," Brandon said with the confident air of someone who believed victory was assured. Victoria took a deep breath, using the same centering technique she employed before difficult flight maneuvers. Then, with explosive power that surprised the onlookers, she leapt onto the rope and began to climb. Her technique was flawless, using the optimal combination of arm strength and leg grips that military training had instilled in her. She moved up the rope with a fluid efficiency that made the challenging climb look almost effortless. When she reached the top, she rang the bell with a sharp tap, then descended with the same controlled precision. The gym had fallen completely silent. Brandon stared at his phone, mouth slightly open. "Time?" Victoria asked calmly, though she already knew she had beaten his record. 6.3 seconds, he said in disbelief. That's impossible." "Not for someone with proper training," Victoria replied simply. Coach Patterson pushed through the crowd of stunned students, her expression a mix of surprise and approval. "Where did you learn to climb like that, Calloway?" "Military training, coach," Victoria answered truthfully if incompletely. "Well, I've never seen anything like it," the coach said, clearly impressed. "That's a new school record." A murmur ran through the gathered students. Brittany Lawson, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward with narrowed eyes. "Let me guess, another skill you picked up flying fighter jets?" she asked sarcastically. "No," Victoria replied. "This one came from basic survival training. All pilots have to be able to extract themselves from difficult terrain in case of ejection or crash landing." The casual way she referenced ejection and crash landings, as if they were everyday concerns rather than extraordinary emergencies, caused another wave of murmurs among the students. Brandon's initial shock was giving way to resentment, his status as the school's athletic star suddenly threatened by this strange girl in a flight suit. "Lucky climb," he muttered, "beginner's luck." Victoria didn't bother to respond. She had already given away more than she had intended by accepting his challenge. As she turned to walk back to the bleachers, Brittany stepped into her path. "You know, it's one thing to wear a costume for attention," she said, her voice low and cutting. "But it's another thing entirely to make up stories about military service. My brother is actually in the army, serving overseas right now, and he would be disgusted by your little act." Something in Brittany's tone, the genuine emotion behind her words, made Victoria pause. The other girl wasn't just being mean for the sake of social dominance. She actually believed Victoria was dishonoring real service members. "I respect your brother's service," Victoria said carefully, "and I would never pretend to be something I'm not." "Right," Brittany scoffed. "So you expect us to believe you're some kind of teenage Top Gun who just happens to be slumming it at Westridge High?" Before Victoria could respond, the bell rang signaling the end of class. Students began dispersing, many of them still casting curious or skeptical glances her way. "This isn't over," Brittany warned as she turned to leave. "People who lie about military service to get attention deserve to be exposed." Victoria watched her go, a heavy feeling settling in her chest. She had come to Westridge hoping to blend in, to honor her father's memory privately while fulfilling her promise to her mother. Instead, she had become the center of attention and controversy, her honesty questioned when she had only told partial truths. As she gathered her things, she noticed Danny waiting for her near the gym exit. He approached with an expression of amazement. "That climb was incredible," he said with genuine admiration. "How did you learn to do that?" Victoria gave him a tired smile. "Long story." "I'd like to hear it sometime," he said, "if you want to tell it." "Maybe," she replied, surprised to find that she meant it. As they walked together toward their next class, Danny lowered his voice. "Don't let Brittany and Brandon get to you. They're just threatened because you don't fit into their neat little social hierarchy." "I'm used to standing out," Victoria admitted, "just not for these reasons." "So what are the usual reasons?" Danny asked with genuine curiosity. Victoria hesitated, then decided to offer another small piece of truth. "Being one of the youngest female test pilots in Air Force history tends to make you noticeable." Danny stopped walking and stared at her. Wait, you're serious? You're actually a test pilot, for real? For real, she confirmed quietly. But I'd appreciate if you kept that information to yourself. Today is about honoring my father, not drawing attention to myself. Your secret's safe with me, Danny promised, his eyes wide with newfound respect. But wow, that's incredible. It's just my job, Victoria said with a small shrug, though she couldn't help feeling a touch of pride at his reaction. It was the first genuine appreciation she'd encountered all day for who she really was. As they parted ways for their final classes of the day, Victoria felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her regretted coming to Westridge, regretted wearing her father's flight suit and drawing the attention and skepticism it had provoked. But another part of her felt a quiet satisfaction at having maintained her integrity, at having honored her father in the face of misunderstanding and disrespect. What she couldn't know was that the day's events had set in motion a chain of revelations that would soon change everything, not just for her, but for the entire school. Because sometimes, the truth has a way of revealing itself when we least expect it, in ways we could never anticipate. Advanced physics with Dr. Eleanor Stanton was held in a laboratory filled with equipment that would have looked primitive compared to the high-tech simulators and testing facilities at Edwards. But Victoria felt a small thrill of familiarity at the sight of the whiteboard covered in equations of motion and force. This was a language she understood intimately, the mathematical foundation upon which all flight was built. Dr. Stanton was a slender woman in her early 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that assessed Victoria's unusual attire without comment as she entered the classroom. Unlike the other teachers, she simply nodded toward an empty lab station and continued preparing materials for the day's experiment. Pairs today, Dr. Stanton announced as the final students filtered in. You'll be conducting experiments on the relationship between mass, force, and acceleration. Find a partner and collect your materials from the front table. Victoria stood awkwardly as students naturally gravitated toward friends, leaving her conspicuously alone. She was about to approach Dr. Stanton when Danny Park appeared at her side. "Partners?" he asked with a hopeful smile. "Definitely," Victoria replied, relieved to see a friendly face. As they gathered their materials, Danny leaned closer. "Fair warning, I'm pretty serious about physics. My dad's an aerospace engineer at Lockheed Martin, so I've been surrounded by this stuff my whole life." Lockheed, Victoria's interest was instantly piqued. "Does he work on the F-35 program?" Danny's eyes widened slightly. "Yeah, actually, he's on the propulsion systems team. How did you know?" The Lightning II's propulsion design is one of the most talked-about engineering achievements in the last 2 decades, Victoria said carefully. Anyone serious about aviation knows the name. Before Danny could press further, Dr. Stanton called the class to order, and they returned to their lab station. The experiment was straightforward, measuring the acceleration of objects with different masses when subjected to the same force. As they worked, Danny continued their conversation in hushed tones. "So about that test pilot thing," he began cautiously. "Were you serious, or was that just a way to get rid of me?" Victoria adjusted their experimental apparatus with practiced precision. "I was serious," she replied quietly. "But it's complicated, and not something I really want broadcast around school." "I get that," Danny nodded. "But how? Don't you need to be an officer, go through the academy and everything?" "Special circumstances," Victoria said, carefully measuring the force applied to their test object. "My aptitude scores were off the charts, and the Air Force has accelerated commissioning programs for exceptional candidates." "That's incredible," Danny breathed. "So you've actually flown the F-35. the same ones my dad helps build. I've done more than fly them, Victoria said, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. I've tested their limits, found their breaking points, helped refine their systems. As she spoke, her hands moved through the experimental procedure with unconscious expertise, adjusting variables and recording results with a precision that reflected years of technical training. Danny watched, fascinated both by her story and her evident mastery of the scientific principles they were studying. "What's it like?" he asked, his voice hushed with genuine wonder. "Flying something that advanced, that powerful?" Victoria paused, considering how to explain the inexplicable feeling of piloting a fifth-generation fighter. "Imagine the most intense roller coaster you've ever experienced," she began. "Now imagine that you're in complete control of it, feeling every subtle vibration through your body, making split-second decisions at supersonic speeds while pulling forces that would make most people black out." "The G-forces must be incredible," Danny said. "They are," Victoria confirmed. "Most people can't handle more than 5 GS without proper training. In the F-35, we routinely pull 9 GS during high-performance maneuvers. That means your body weighs 9 times its normal weight. Your blood gets pulled toward your legs, away from your brain. Without a G-suit and proper breathing techniques, you'd lose consciousness in seconds." Their conversation was interrupted by a loud crash from the lab station beside them. Brandon Garrett had accidentally knocked over his experimental apparatus, sending metal weights clattering across the floor. As he bent to retrieve them, his eyes locked with Victoria's, and it was clear from his expression that he had overheard at least part of their conversation. "Still telling tall tales, Calloway?" he asked loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "Now you're a test pilot who pulls 9 GS. What's next? Space missions to Mars?" Several students laughed. Dr. Stanton looked up from helping another group. "Focus on your own experiment, Mr. Garrett," she said firmly. "Unless you'd prefer to explain to the class why your results don't match the expected values." Brandon's face reddened slightly as he returned to his station, but he continued to shoot skeptical glances toward Victoria throughout the class. When the bell finally rang, he deliberately bumped into their table as he passed, causing their carefully arranged apparatus to shift. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Turbulence. Better pull some GS to stabilize, pilot." As he walked away laughing with his friends, Danny shook his head in disgust. "Ignore him. He's just insecure because you showed him up on the rope climb." "I'm used to it," Victoria said, carefully rearranging their equipment. "Most male pilots weren't exactly welcoming when I first joined the program either. The difference is that they eventually had to respect my abilities because I could outfly them." Dr. Stanton approached their station as the other students filed out. "Impressive work," she said, examining their results. "Your data is nearly perfect. Most students struggle with the consistent application of force." "Thank you, Dr. Stanton," Victoria replied. "The principles are familiar to me." The teacher's sharp eyes studied Victoria more carefully. "That's a Thunderbird flight suit, isn't it? The Air Force demonstration team." "Yes, ma'am," Victoria confirmed, surprised by the recognition. "It was my father's." "I thought I recognized the insignia. My wife was a flight surgeon at Nellie's for several years. She worked with the Thunderbird pilots occasionally." Dr. Stanton paused, her expression softening slightly. "Was your father Robert Calloway by any chance? The one they called Eagle?" Victoria felt her heart skip a beat. "Yes, ma'am, he was." Dr. Stanton nodded slowly. "I never met him personally, but Laura, my wife, spoke highly of him. He was legendary for his precision flying and his ability to handle extreme G-forces." She glanced at the equations on the board. Physics in action at the highest level. He used to say that understanding the math was what separated good pilots from great ones, Victoria said, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. He could feel when an equation was wrong in his bones. A rare gift, Dr. Stanton agreed, and one that seems to have been passed down. She gestured to their perfect experimental results. You have a natural intuition for these principles that can't be taught. As they left the classroom, Danny turned to Victoria with renewed awe. Even the teachers know about your dad. He must have been really something special. He was, Victoria said simply, unwilling to elaborate further in the crowded hallway. They were headed toward their lockers when the school's public address system crackled to life. Victoria Calloway, please report to the guidance counselor's office. Victoria Calloway to guidance. Danny gave her a sympathetic look. Oh, someone probably reported your outfit as a dress code violation. Probably, Victoria agreed with a resigned sigh. I knew this was coming. Want me to wait for you? Danny offered. Thanks, but this might take a while. You should go home. Okay, but take my number at least, he insisted, scribbling on a scrap of paper. In case you want to, talk about aerospace engineering or fighter jets or whatever. Victoria accepted the paper with a genuine smile, the first one that had reached her eyes all day. Thanks, Danny, for everything. The guidance counselor's office was located in the administrative wing of the school, a carpeted sanctuary of muted colors and motivational posters. Dr. Patricia Simmons was a compassionate-looking woman in her mid-40s who greeted Victoria with professional warmth. Please have a seat, Ms. Calloway, she said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. I understand it's been quite a first day for you. Victoria sat with her back straight, hands resting on her knees in the formal posture that had been drilled into her through years of military briefings. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Simmons studied her with kind but evaluating eyes. Several teachers and students have expressed concern about your attire today. Our dress code doesn't typically allow for military uniforms unless they're part of an official JROTC program. I understand, Victoria replied evenly. Today is a special circumstance. It's the anniversary of my father's death. He was an Air Force pilot, and wearing his flight suit is my way of honoring his memory. The counselor's expression softened. I'm very sorry for your loss, Victoria. Losing a parent is one of the most difficult experiences anyone can face, especially at your age. Thank you, Victoria said, the formal response automatic and protective. Colonel Harrison mentioned that your father was with the Thunderbirds, Dr. Simmons continued. That must have been very prestigious. It was. The Thunderbirds represent the absolute pinnacle of tactical aviation skill within the Air Force. My father flew with them for 3 years before returning to combat operations. Dr. Simmons nodded thoughtfully. I can understand why you'd want to honor such an accomplished parent. However, I'm concerned that your choice of tribute has created some social challenges for you on your first day. I'm aware of that, Victoria acknowledged, but some things are more important than social acceptance. The counselor leaned forward slightly. That's a very mature perspective, Victoria, more mature than I typically encounter in students your age. She paused, studying Victoria's composed demeanor more carefully. Your transfer records indicate that you've had an unusual educational background. Accelerated programs, specialized technical training, extended absences for what's listed only as government service. Victoria remained silent, neither confirming nor denying the implications. I want to be clear, Dr. Simmons continued. I'm not here to pry into classified matters or to make you uncomfortable. My only concern is ensuring that your time at Westridge is beneficial for you. I appreciate that, Victoria said carefully. May I ask why you chose to enroll at Westridge for your final semester? With your background, there must have been more specialized options available. Victoria considered her response. I made a promise to my mother, she said finally, to experience civilian education before making my next career decision. My family moved here when my mother remarried, and Westridge was the logical choice. Dr. Simmons nodded understandingly. Family promises are important. She hesitated, then added, My brother served 2 tours in Iraq. He found the transition back to civilian life challenging. The military creates a very different mindset, a different way of experiencing the world. For the first time, Victoria felt a genuine connection with the counselor. Yes, it does. The structure, the clarity of purpose, it's hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. I imagine it's even more difficult for someone your age, straddling these 2 very different worlds, Dr. Simmons observed. Most teenagers struggle with identity formation under normal circumstances. Your situation is uniquely complex. Victoria felt an unexpected wave of emotion at being so accurately understood. She maintained her composed exterior through practiced discipline, but something in Dr. Simmons's gentle insight had touched a vulnerability she rarely acknowledged. I'm managing, she said simply. I believe you are, the counselor agreed, but my door is always open if you need someone to talk to. They resolved the dress code question, an allowance made for today given the circumstances, full compliance expected from tomorrow, and Dr. Simmons mentioned both the STEM club and an upcoming Veterans Day assembly as possible avenues for Victoria to participate meaningfully during her semester at Westridge. One other thought, Dr. Simmons added as Victoria rose to leave. We're organizing a special assembly for Veterans Day next week. Given your unique perspective, you might be interested in speaking. Not about anything classified, simply about what it means to carry on a family's tradition of service. Victoria paused in the doorway. It was the kind of invitation that pulled at something deep in her chest, the part of her that had always believed service deserved to be spoken about openly, not hidden behind carefully maintained cover stories. I'll think about it, she said finally, genuinely. As Victoria left the counselor's office, she found herself unexpectedly thoughtful. The hallways were nearly empty now, most students having rushed home at the final bell. As she approached her locker, she noticed a small group of students lingering nearby, among them Brandon Garrett and Brittany Lawson. Here comes G.I. Jane, Brandon said loudly. Or should I say Captain Marvel? Brittany rolled her eyes at his juvenile taunt, but studied Victoria with renewed interest. Dr. Stanton says your dad was some hotshot pilot. That still doesn't explain why you talk like you've flown fighter jets yourself. Victoria opened her locker without responding, maintaining the outward calm that was second nature to her. What's the matter, Calloway? Lost your wings? Brandon pressed, emboldened by her silence. I don't owe you an explanation, Victoria said finally, closing her locker with deliberate control. See, that's what I don't get, Brittany said, stepping closer. If you really are who you pretend to be, why not just prove it? Show us some ID, some evidence that you're not just playing dress-up in daddy's clothes. The accusation stung more than Victoria wanted to admit. She had faced doubters before, male pilots who couldn't accept that a woman, especially one so young, could possibly match their skills. But this felt different, more personal. Before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Leave her alone, Garrett. Colonel Harrison stood at the end of the hallway, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. Don't you have football practice to get to? Brandon's demeanor changed instantly. Yes, sir, just heading there now. Then I suggest you move with purpose. Brandon and his friends departed quickly. Brittany lingered with a final measuring look at Victoria before following the others. Colonel Harrison approached once they were gone. My office, Calloway, now. Victoria followed him to the history department. Inside was a small but meticulously organized office that immediately reminded her of military quarters. Everything had its place, from the precisely aligned books on the shelves to the carefully arranged photographs on the desk. One of these caught Victoria's eye immediately, a faded image of younger pilots standing before an F-16, and among them, unmistakably, her father. "You really did know him," she said softly. Harrison nodded, taking a seat behind his desk. "Not as well as some, but yes. We crossed paths several times during training and later when I was briefly attached to the Thunderbird support staff." He gestured to the photo. "That was taken at Nellie's about 15 years ago. Your father had just completed his qualification for the demonstration team." Victoria stared at the image, drinking in the sight of her father in his younger days, standing tall and proud in the same flight suit she now wore. "He never mentioned you." "No reason he would have," Harrison shrugged. "But in the fighter community, everyone knows everyone eventually." He studied her with new interest. What he did mention occasionally was his brilliant daughter who could recite thrust-to-weight ratios before she could read children's books. A small smile touched Victoria's lips at the memory. "He used to quiz me on aircraft specifications, the way other parents quiz their kids on multiplication tables." "And now you're flying the most advanced fighter in the world," Harrison said. "Captain Victoria Calloway, Edwards Test Pilot Program, youngest female accepted into the elite tactical aviation corps." Victoria's eyes widened slightly. "How did you?" "I still have friends in the service," Harrison explained. "When you mentioned your name and I saw that flight suit, I made a call during my free period. Your reputation precedes you, Captain." "I'd prefer to keep that information private," Victoria said carefully. "I'm here as a student, not a pilot." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with the evaluating gaze of an officer assessing a new recruit. "May I ask why? Most people in your position would be proud to be recognized for such exceptional achievements." "It's complicated," Victoria admitted. "I promised my mother one semester of normal civilian life before making my final decision about accepting a new posting." "Noble," Harrison nodded. "But I wonder if you've considered that pretending to be someone you're not might be more damaging than simply being honest about who you are." "With all due respect, sir, I haven't lied to anyone," Victoria countered. "I've simply chosen not to volunteer information that would make it impossible for me to be treated like a normal student." "And how's that working out so far?" Harrison asked with a hint of wry humor. Despite herself, Victoria felt a smile tugging at her lips. "Not exceptionally well." Harrison chuckled, a sound that transformed his stern features into something more approachable. "I thought as much." He gestured toward the window through which the football field was visible. "I saw what happened in PE today. That rope climb was impressive, by the way. Classic military technique." "Force of habit," Victoria admitted. "Exactly," Harrison nodded. "You can wear civilian clothes, Calloway, but you can't hide who you are. The way you stand, the way you speak, the precision in your movements, it all screams military to anyone who knows what to look for." "So what are you suggesting?" Victoria asked. "I'm not suggesting anything, just making an observation. Your strategy is your own to determine." He paused, then added, "But if you're interested in my opinion, I think being honest about your accomplishments could open doors here rather than close them." "You mean like the Veterans Day Assembly Dr. Simmons mentioned?" Among other things, Harrison nodded. Westridge has an excellent STEM program. Dr. Stanton in particular has been pushing for more aviation-related curriculum. Someone with your expertise could be a valuable resource. Victoria felt torn between her promise to her mother and the undeniable pull of her true passion. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "Good," Harrison said, rising from his desk. He extended his hand formally. "It's an honor to have you in my class, Captain Calloway. Your father would be proud of the officer you've become." The school buses had long departed, so Victoria began the walk home. As she turned onto Maple Street, she noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench at the small park that marked the halfway point to her house. Danny Park looked up from his textbook and waved when he saw her. "I thought you might come this way," he called as she approached. "Are you stalking me, Park?" Victoria asked, but her tone was light without accusation. "Strategically positioned for an accidental encounter," he corrected with a grin. "Totally different." Despite herself, Victoria found his earnest humor refreshing after the tensions of the day. "Well, your strategy paid off. Here I am." "How was the guidance counselor?" Danny asked as they fell into step together. "Not bad, actually," Victoria admitted. She seemed to understand about the flight suit. Her brother served in Iraq. "Military families get it," Danny nodded. "My dad works with veterans all the time at Lockheed. Says they're the best engineers because they understand both the theory and the practical application in a way civilians rarely do." "Your dad sounds interesting," Victoria said. "What's his specialty again?" "Propulsion systems," Danny replied with evident pride. "He's been working on the F-35 program for almost 15 years. Started with the early prototypes and has been with it through all the development phases." "That's impressive," Victoria said sincerely. "The F-35's propulsion system is revolutionary. The thrust vectoring capabilities alone are years ahead of previous generation aircraft." Danny's eyes lit up. "That's what Dad always says. He actually has a model of the engine assembly in his home office. He's kind of obsessed." "It's a worthy obsession," Victoria smiled. "That engine has saved my life more than once during test flights." Danny stopped walking and stared at her. "Wait, so you really do fly the F-35? You weren't just saying that to impress me?" "Why would I make up something so specific?" Victoria asked, genuinely puzzled. Danny laughed softly. "Fair point." His expression turned more serious. "My dad would absolutely lose his mind if he knew I was walking home with an actual F-35 test pilot. He's been working on that propulsion system for 15 years. The Lightning II is basically his life's work." "Your father's work is extraordinary," Victoria said. "The thrust vectoring capabilities of that engine have gotten me out of more than one situation that might otherwise have gone very badly." When they reached the corner of Oak and Elm, Danny stopped. "This is my street, but hey, there's something I wanted to ask you." "What's that?" "My dad's team is hosting an engineering open house at Lockheed next weekend. They do it every year to encourage STEM students. There's going to be flight simulators, engineering demonstrations, even a mock cockpit you can sit in." He hesitated, suddenly seeming nervous. "I was wondering if you might want to come. As my guest, I mean. Though I guess sitting in a mock cockpit would be pretty boring when you've flown the real thing." Victoria felt an unexpected flutter of something almost like normal teenage emotion. Not Captain Calloway being asked to evaluate a technical demonstration, but just Victoria being invited somewhere by someone who genuinely shared her passion. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "Even test pilots can appreciate a good simulator." Danny's face lit up with a grin that transformed his usually serious expression. Really? That's awesome. I'll text you the details. He started down his street, then turned back. And Victoria, for what it's worth, I think what you did today, wearing your dad's flight suit, was really cool. I wish I'd known him. As she watched him go, Victoria stood for a moment in the quiet of the street, processing the strange complexity of emotions the day had brought. She had come to Westridge expecting to blend in anonymously, to experience what her mother called normal life. Instead, she had found herself more visible than ever, yet somehow seen more clearly by a few people than she had anticipated. She reached beneath the collar of her father's flight suit and pressed her palm flat against the dog tags resting against her sternum. 3 years, Dad, she thought. 3 years, and today still felt like the first morning without you. Then she tucked the dog tags back against her chest and continued walking home. The following morning brought a different kind of challenge. True to her word, Victoria had exchanged her father's flight suit for standard civilian attire: jeans, a simple blue button-down shirt, and casual sneakers. The transformation was remarkable. Without the distinctive uniform, she looked like any other student at Westridge High, save perhaps for the military precision of her ponytail and the unusually perfect posture with which she carried herself. She had laid her father's flight suit across the chair in her bedroom before leaving, smoothing the Thunderbird patch with one careful hand. It had done its work. So had she. Today would be something different. The yellow school bus arrived at her corner just as it had the day before, but this time when Victoria boarded, there was no immediate hush, no turning of heads. A few students who remembered her from the previous day did double takes at her transformed appearance, but most barely glanced up from their phones. Brittany Lawson, however, narrowed her eyes as Victoria passed her seat. Decided to dress like a normal person today. Good call. Victoria ignored the comment, finding an empty seat near the middle of the bus. As she settled in, she felt the weight of her father's dog tags beneath her shirt, the private connection that didn't require public display. She had honored him yesterday. Today she would simply try to do something harder. Be present, be a student, be someone her mother had asked her to be, even if only for a semester. The morning classes passed with relative calm. Without the flight suit to mark her as different, Victoria found it easier to blend into the background, to observe rather than be observed. In English, she was just another student analyzing The Great Gatsby. In calculus, she was merely one of several strong performers, her mathematical precision drawing approval from the teacher without drawing attention from the class. By lunch period, Victoria had begun to relax slightly, to feel that perhaps the social terrain of Westridge was navigable after all. As she entered the cafeteria with her lunch tray, she scanned the room automatically, her trained situational awareness cataloging exits, sightlines, and social clusters with the same economy she would apply in any new environment. Her eyes landed on Danny, who was waving enthusiastically from a table near the windows, where he sat with a small group of students she recognized from their advanced science classes. "Victoria, over here," he called. She made her way over, settling into the empty chair Danny had clearly been saving for her. "Everyone, this is Victoria," he introduced. "Victoria, this is the STEM club. Amy's our resident computer genius, Ravi's into robotics, and Wei specializes in making things explode while calling it chemistry." "That was one time," Wei protested good-naturedly, "and it was a controlled explosion for experimental purposes." Victoria smiled. "Nice to meet you all." "You're the new girl with the flight suit, right?" Amy asked directly. "Danny says your dad was a fighter pilot." "He was," Victoria confirmed. "He flew with the Air Force Thunderbirds demonstration team." "That's incredible," Ravi said enthusiastically. "My uncle is in the Navy submarines, not quite as dramatic as jets." Every military role is important, Victoria said. The response came automatically, instilled through years of inter-service cooperation briefings, but she meant it. Spoken like someone from a military family, Wei observed shrewdly. So is that why you're into aviation, following in your dad's footsteps? Aviation has always been my passion, Victoria said carefully. The physics of flight, the engineering challenges, the human performance aspects, it all fascinates me. Danny says you know a lot about fighter jets, Amy prompted, especially the F-35. I've studied them extensively, Victoria acknowledged, catching Danny's eye with a small, grateful nod for his discretion. The conversation flowed naturally from there. Aeronautics, supersonic flight, the integration of artificial intelligence into modern aviation systems. For the first time in 2 days, Victoria felt genuinely at ease, able to share her technical knowledge freely among people who received it with interest rather than skepticism. The peaceful exchange ended when Brandon Garrett approached their table, his athletic confidence evident in every movement. He glanced around the table with amusement, his eyes settling on Victoria. "No costume today, Calloway." "Did you need something, Brandon?" Danny asked with an assertiveness that was new in him. Brandon ignored Danny and kept his focus on Victoria. "Rope climb yesterday was something, almost like you'd had actual military training." "I grew up on Air Force bases," Victoria said evenly. "You pick things up." "Right," Brandon nodded with exaggerated skepticism. "Just like you picked up all that technical talk about G-forces and supersonic speeds. So that was just stories from your dad, right? Not first-hand experience." "Believe whatever you want, Brandon," Victoria said with professional detachment. "Your opinion doesn't affect my reality." Something in the absolute certainty of her tone seemed to unsettle him. He shifted his approach. "If you really have all this amazing experience, why hide it? Prove it. Unless, of course, you can't." "She doesn't have to prove anything to you," Danny said, rising slightly from his seat. Brandon's attention swiveled. "Defending your girlfriend, Park, didn't know you had it in you." "She's not my—" Danny stopped himself. "Just leave her alone, Brandon. Not everyone needs to show off constantly like you do." Brandon's expression darkened. "Careful, Park. You're starting to sound like you need a reminder of where you stand around here." "Is that a threat?" Danny asked, rising fully from his seat despite being several inches shorter and many pounds lighter. The cafeteria around them had gone quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Victoria stood with practiced smoothness, positioning herself between the two of them with a natural authority that seemed to surprise everyone, including Brandon. "That's enough," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable command presence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This conversation is over, Brandon. Return to your table." Brandon blinked, momentarily uncertain how to process being addressed with such authority by a fellow student. "You don't tell me what to do, Calloway." "I just did," Victoria replied calmly. "And you're going to comply because causing a scene in the cafeteria will reflect poorly on your position as team captain. Walk away." The standoff lasted only a few seconds. Then Brandon shook his head with forced casualness. "Whatever. This isn't over. If you're going to talk the talk, sooner or later you're going to have to prove you can walk the walk." As he rejoined his teammates across the cafeteria, Danny sat back down shakily. "I've never stood up to him before." "You did well," Victoria said. The praise was automatic, the kind she would offer to a junior officer after their first difficult confrontation. "No, you did well," Amy corrected, looking at Victoria with undisguised respect. That was like watching a commanding officer handle a subordinate. "Experience with bullies," Victoria shrugged, though she recognized immediately that her military bearing had shown through her civilian disguise more clearly than she'd intended. Ravi, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, studied her with a thoughtful expression. "My uncle says you can always tell military personnel by the way they carry themselves," he said conversationally as they began gathering their trays at the end of lunch. "Even in civilian clothes. Posture, situational awareness, the way they enter a room." "Your uncle sounds observant," Victoria said carefully. "He is," Ravi agreed. "He also says most people underestimate young women, which is generally their tactical error." He smiled quickly. "Your secret's safe with me, whatever it is." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of classes, and with each period Victoria felt the subtle shift that had taken place in the school's atmosphere. Word of her confrontation with Brandon had spread, and with it, a quiet recalibration of how students perceived her. She wasn't the strange girl in the flight suit anymore. She was someone different, harder to categorize, harder to dismiss. After the final bell, as the hallways filled with the surge of students released for the day, Victoria noticed Brittany Lawson waiting near her locker, alone for once, without her usual entourage. There was something different in her posture too, less performance, more intent. "Calloway," Brittany said. "We need to talk, not here, the oak tree in the courtyard, 5 minutes." Victoria considered for a moment. Something in Brittany's tone had changed, stripped of the social theater that had characterized every interaction so far. This was not another attempt at dominance. 5 minutes, Victoria agreed. The central courtyard was quiet in the late afternoon, the oak tree casting long shadows across the stone benches arranged around its base. Brittany was already there, a tablet computer in her lap, her expression unusually serious. "I did some research last night," Brittany said without preamble. She turned the tablet so Victoria could see the screen. "This is an article from 3 years ago, a classified Air Force mission where a pilot sacrificed himself to save his squadron and a group of civilians. The pilot's name was Robert Eagle Calloway." Victoria felt a familiar tightening in her chest, not grief exactly, but the particular weight that her father's name carried whenever it appeared in print. She kept her expression neutral. Brittany swiped to a second article. "And then I found this, posted about 6 months ago on an Air Force recruitment blog." Victoria looked at the screen and felt a cold shock of recognition. There, partially obscured but still identifiable, was a photograph of her in her flight suit, standing beside her F-35. The headline read, "Breaking Barriers, the New Face of Tactical Aviation." "They don't name you directly," Brittany continued, watching Victoria's reaction closely. "But they describe a female test pilot who has broken multiple records for G-force tolerance and combat simulation scores, and they call her the daughter of a legendary Thunderbird pilot who carried on her father's legacy in ways even he couldn't have imagined." Victoria kept her face still. The article had been published against her wishes, part of a recruitment initiative she had reluctantly participated in at her commanding officer's insistence. She had hoped it would circulate only within Air Force circles. "My point," Brittany said, setting down the tablet, "is that you're actually her, aren't you? The pilot in this article. You really have flown fighter jets." The moment stretched between them. Victoria weighed her options quickly: confirmation, denial, deflection. Before she could choose, Brittany continued, and her voice had dropped into something quieter and more personal. "My brother is deployed in Afghanistan right now. He's Air Force just like your dad was. That's why I reacted the way I did yesterday. I thought you were just some kid disrespecting the uniform, using it like a costume." She paused. "I was wrong." Victoria studied Brittany carefully, reassessing everything. "I would never disrespect the uniform," she said finally, "or anyone who wears it." "I know that now," Brittany said. She met Victoria's eyes directly. "What I don't understand is why you're here at Westridge, pretending to be a regular student when you're actually this." She gestured at the tablet. Victoria sighed and made her decision. "I made a promise to my mother. After my father died, she worried I was following his path too closely, missing out on things a person my age is supposed to experience. She asked me for 1 semester of civilian life before I make my final call on my next assignment." "So you really are a test pilot," Brittany said. The awe in her voice was genuine, unperformed. "An actual fighter pilot." "Test pilot," Victoria corrected gently. "I evaluate aircraft systems under extreme conditions. It's different from combat aviation, though the skills overlap." "Why hide it?" Brittany pressed. "Most people would never stop talking about something like that." "Because I wanted to be treated like a person, not a spectacle," Victoria said simply. Brittany laughed, a real laugh, without the polished social edge that usually colored her voice. "How's that working out?" "Not particularly well," Victoria admitted. The two of them sat in the quiet of the courtyard for a moment, an unlikely stillness between them. "I won't tell anyone," Brittany said finally. "Your secret stays with me." "Why?" Victoria asked directly. "This would be significant social currency for you." Brittany looked briefly offended, then thoughtful. "Because my brother would be furious if he found out I'd given someone a hard time for wearing a service uniform." She paused, then added more quietly, "And because I know what it's like to live in someone else's shadow, to have people see a family name before they see you." Victoria felt the unexpected recognition of that statement, the weight of a legacy that both lifted and pressed down. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." As Brittany gathered her things to leave, she glanced back one last time. "For what it's worth, Calloway, I think what you're doing takes a specific kind of courage. Not the flying at supersonic speeds kind, though that's obviously its own category, but choosing to walk into something completely unfamiliar on purpose because you made a promise. That's not nothing." Victoria watched her cross the courtyard and disappear through the side gate. She sat with that for a moment. Brittany Lawson, of all people. The world was reliably strange. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother asking when she'd be home. Victoria typed a brief reply, then sat quietly for another minute beneath the oak tree, thinking about promises. She had promised her mother a semester of civilian life. She had honored her father for 1 day. She had made one unexpected friend and earned one unexpected ally, and she had held her integrity intact through all of it. Maybe, she thought, her mother had been right about something. Not that the cockpit wasn't where she belonged, it was, unambiguously, without question. But perhaps belonging somewhere didn't have to mean that everything else was irrelevant. Perhaps Danny's enthusiasm for propulsion engineering, and Dr. Stanton's quiet recognition, and even Dr. Simmons's offer to speak at the Veterans Day Assembly. Perhaps these things could coexist with the identity she had already built. She stood, smoothed the front of her civilian shirt, and headed toward the gate. 2 days into the experiment of being an ordinary person, Captain Victoria Hawk Calloway was not yet convinced it was possible. But she was, for the first time, genuinely curious about the attempt. She was almost at the front gate when she heard them, the unmistakable sound of jet engines overhead, growing rapidly from a distant whisper to a concussive roar. Victoria's head came up instantly, her trained eye finding the formation in the sky before most of the remaining students had even registered the sound. 4 F-16s in diamond formation, red and white contrails cutting precise geometry against the blue, the Thunderbirds unmistakably, at altitude and moving fast. The Thunderbirds, Victoria breathed, the words barely audible. Danny materialized beside her from somewhere. He seemed to have a talent for this, and tilted his head back. Wow, you don't usually see them just flying over like that. They're not supposed to be in this airspace, Victoria said quietly, her mind already running approach vectors and altitude assessments without conscious instruction. Not for a standard transit. This is something deliberate. Other students had stopped to watch, phones rising reflexively to capture the footage. The four aircraft completed a precision rollover and swept back across the horizon, the thunder of their passage rattling the windows of the gymnasium building. Victoria felt it in her sternum, not just the physical vibration, but something older and less rational. 3 years ago, her father had performed that same maneuver in skies just like this one, for crowds who had looked up and felt exactly what she was feeling now. Then the Thunderbirds were gone, and something else was coming. She heard it before she saw it, the distinctive harmonic of a fifth-generation power plant, a sound she knew the way a musician knows a particular instrument's voice, different from the F-16's, deeper, more precise. "That's not the Thunderbirds," Victoria said, her voice shifting into the clipped register of a pilot reading a situation. "That's an F-35. The aircraft came in low, far lower than any regulatory compliance would permit over a civilian area. Its approach so fast that most of the watching students barely had time to register it before the pressure wave hit. Car alarms triggered in the parking lot. Students ducked and covered their ears. Teachers came running from the school building in alarm. But Victoria stood absolutely still, watching. Her trained eye pulled the details from the blur. The unmistakable silhouette of the Lightning II, the specific markings of the Edwards Test Squadron, and beneath the cockpit, the call sign. Eagle. Her father's call sign, painted on her aircraft, the one she had left at Edwards 3 days ago. The F-35 banked hard, a maneuver that would have rendered an untrained pilot unconscious from the G-loading, then swept back in a wider arc and came over the school a second time, slower now, and as it passed, a flare deployed from beneath its wing. Brilliant white, burning against the afternoon sky. Victoria felt the calm of absolute clarity settle over her like a physical thing. "What is that?" Danny asked, his voice tight with alarm. "Some kind of weapon?" "No," Victoria said. "It's a signal flare, emergency recall protocol." She was already calculating transit time to Edwards. "Every pilot in my squadron knows that pattern, priority 1. The aircraft made one final pass, lower still, and waggled its wings once. The universal pilot's greeting, unmistakably personal, then climbed hard and disappeared into the east, the thunder of its departure rolling across the school grounds long after it was gone. Around Victoria, chaos had organized itself into the familiar shapes of institutional response. Principal Davidson striding across the lawn demanding explanations, teachers herding students back toward the buildings, the public address system crackling to life with instructions to suspend all outdoor activities. Colonel Harrison had appeared at the edge of the crowd and was already watching Victoria across the heads of the students between them. She walked to him directly. "Was that what I think it was?" he said quietly. "Yes, sir," Victoria replied. "Edwards Test Squadron emergency recall, priority 1. She paused. "I need to go." Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and pressed something into her hand without ceremony, a small flash drive. "There may be something on there you'll want your co to see," he said. "It concerns the research the Thunderbird support staff kept on your father's final mission parameters. I've been holding onto it for the right moment." He looked at her steadily. "I think this is the right moment." Victoria closed her fingers around it. "Thank you, sir." Your father would be proud, was all he added, and turned to help Davidson manage the crowd. Danny was at her shoulder. That was for you, he said. It was not a question. Yes. Do you need a ride? My car's in the lot. Victoria almost smiled despite everything. You have a car. 15-year-old Honda. More miles than the space shuttle. But it runs, and I'm guessing Edwards is about an hour out. It is, she said. Thank you, let's go. The drive was mostly quiet, the kind of silence that forms between people who understand each other well enough not to fill it unnecessarily. Danny pushed the aging Honda harder than it probably appreciated. Victoria watched the desert landscape open up around them and turned the flash drive over in her fingers. This means you won't make the Lockheed open house next weekend, Danny said eventually. Despite everything, the urgency, the weight of what waited for her at Edwards, Victoria found herself laughing. It came out real and unguarded. Probably not, no. Will you come back to Westridge, I mean, after whatever this is? Victoria considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know, she said honestly. I made a promise to my mother. Military duty takes precedence when it has to, but that doesn't cancel the promise. It just delays it. Danny nodded, eyes on the road. That sounds like something a test pilot would say. Or anyone who's ever tried to keep two commitments at once, Victoria said. When the base perimeter came into view, Victoria directed Danny to pull over at a gas station about a mile short of the main gate. Civilians can't pass the checkpoints without prior authorization, she said, gathering her backpack. Right, Danny put the car in park. I figured. Victoria tore a page from her notebook and wrote her military email address on it. It's monitored, she said, handing it to him, so don't write anything sensitive. But let me know how the Lockheed open house goes. Tell me what you think of the propulsion demo. I mean that. Danny accepted the paper and looked at it for a moment. I will, he glanced up. Be careful up there, okay? Whatever's happening, be careful. Always, she promised. She kissed him on the cheek, a quick, impulsive thing that surprised them both, and then she was out of the car, walking briskly toward the base, the flash drive in her pocket and her father's dog tags against her chest. With each step, the posture shifted. The gait changed. The civilian student she had been performing for 2 days receded like a theater set being cleared from a stage, and Captain Victoria Hawk Calloway came forward to fill the space fully, cleanly, without apology. By the time she reached the main gate, she was entirely herself. The guard snapped to attention. Captain Calloway, we've been expecting you. Colonel Bryant requests your presence in the briefing room immediately. I'll need a change of clothes, Victoria said, indicating her civilian attire. Already arranged, ma'am. Your flight suit is in Ready Room 3. 20 minutes later, properly attired, hair in regulation bun, Victoria strode into the briefing room. The assembled pilots and officers fell quiet as she entered. Colonel Bryant stood at the front of the room beside a screen displaying satellite imagery. Captain Calloway, he said with a nod, glad our message found you. It caused quite a stir at a civilian high school, sir, Victoria replied, taking the seat that had been left for her in the front row. Necessary, Bryant said. We've been trying to reach you through conventional channels for 6 hours. Victoria frowned. My phone was on all day. I received no calls. That's part of the problem, Bryant said grimly, turning to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, approximately 8 hours ago, our secure communication systems began experiencing targeted disruptions. Certain personnel, including Captain Calloway, were specifically isolated from contact. Simultaneously, we detected unauthorized access to highly classified performance metrics from our test flight data systems. The data targeted relates specifically to the experimental thrust vectoring systems in our latest F-35 variants. The room absorbed this in silence. The thrust vectoring systems were the crown jewel of the Lightning II program, the technology that gave the aircraft unparalleled combat maneuverability. They were also among the most closely guarded secrets in the entire Air Force arsenal. The signature of the infiltration bears the hallmarks of a sophisticated state actor, Bryant continued, and they appear to have had assistance from inside this installation. Espionage, treason. The words settled over the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. The data they targeted, Bryant said, his eyes finding Victoria's, was specifically from flight tests conducted by Captain Calloway. The tests that identified critical vulnerabilities in the thrust vectoring system, vulnerabilities that have since been corrected, but which would be catastrophic if exploited by a foreign adversary. Victoria felt every eye in the room. Sir, my data uplinks were encrypted through standard channels. My personal devices were secure to protocol. No one is accusing you, Captain, Bryant said. Quite the opposite. Your expertise with these systems is precisely why you're the only person in this room who can help us understand what an adversary could do with what they've taken. You know these aircraft at a level no one else here does. You've pushed them past the point where the specifications end and the real-world behavior begins. The weight of it settled clearly. This was the work. This was why she had spent years in centrifuges and test corridors and high-altitude cockpits, not for the records, not for the call sign painted on the fuselage, but for moments like this, when the difference between what a pilot knew and what was written in a manual might determine whether other pilots came home. When do we start, sir? Immediately, Bryant said. He nodded to a technician at the terminal, and the screen behind him changed to display a maintenance hangar. In it stood a single F-35 with its panels removed at multiple access points. Victoria recognized it immediately. That's my aircraft. Yes, Bryant confirmed. During the emergency inspection ordered after we detected the breach, this was found installed in the thrust vectoring control system. He gestured, and the image zoomed to a small device wired into the control circuits. A remote override module, sophisticated enough to bypass all redundant safety protocols and assume control of the aircraft's critical systems while in flight. The silence in the room was absolute. Victoria stared at the device, running calculations she didn't want to run. Loss of thrust vectoring control at high G loading, at supersonic speeds, at the altitudes and maneuver profiles she flew during systems testing. There would be no recovery. There would be no ejection window. There would be nothing. It was installed during the past week, Bryant said. While you were on leave, whoever placed it knew your schedule, knew the aircraft would be unflown for several days, and knew exactly where within the control architecture to place it for maximum effect. He paused. This is not a data theft. This is an assassination attempt designed to look like a test flight accident. Victoria felt the cold, focused anger settle over her like a second skin, clean, purposeful, without panic. She had been afraid in cockpits before. She had been afraid when the Hawk hit her sensor housing at 400 knots and the warning systems cascaded, and she had been afraid on the night run she didn't talk about, the one that had earned her the classification she still carried. Fear was data. You processed it and you flew. She thought of the flash drive in her pocket. Sir, she said, Colonel Harrison at Westridge passed me a flash drive before I left. He said it contains Thunderbird support staff research from my father's final mission parameters. Given the nature of what you've just described, the specific targeting of my test profiles, I think his data may be relevant. Bryant's eyes sharpened. Harrison, Frank Harrison, retired 57th Wing. Yes, sir. He's been teaching at Westridge High School. Bryant looked at his intelligence officer. Get it analyzed immediately. He turned back to Victoria. Captain Calloway will lead the technical assessment of the override device and the flight profile vulnerabilities. Major Richards handles counterintelligence. We have 24 hours before we brief the Pentagon. As the room dispersed into its assignments, Victoria remained for a moment in front of the image of her aircraft, her machine, the one she had flown at the edge of what physics permitted and brought back whole each time. Someone had reached into it and built a trap. Someone who knew enough to know exactly where to reach. She would find out who. And then she would do what pilots do. She would solve the problem, file the report, and make it safer for everyone who came after. She turned from the screen and walked toward her team. In a darkened monitor at the far end of the room, she caught a reflection of herself, flight suit, regulation bun, the quiet certainty in her posture that Colonel Harrison had identified in a hallway 2 days ago. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw her father standing at her shoulder, the same expression he had worn in the Nellie's photograph, proud and resolved. "I won't let you down," she said quietly, to the reflection, to the room, to the 3 years of distance between them. Whether she was speaking to her father or to the pilots who would eventually fly the aircraft she was protecting, she couldn't have said with certainty. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps in the end they were the same. Captain Victoria, Hawk. Calloway took her seat at the head of the technical assessment team and opened the first file. Outside, the Mojave sky was turning the deep amber of late afternoon, the same color it had been on the morning she had said goodbye to her aircraft 3 days ago, her hand flat against the fuselage, as if anchoring herself to something true. She was anchored now. This was her legacy. This was her calling. And whatever came next, she would meet it as she had been built to, with precision, with courage, and with the complete, unshakable understanding that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 1 semester, a promise kept, as much as circumstances permitted, and a future waiting, bright and purposeful, on the other side of the work that needed doing tonight. A note from the author. Dear readers, if you have stayed with Victoria all the way to this final page, then you already understand what drew me to write this story, and I suspect you recognize something of yourself in her, or in someone you have loved. I wrote Hawk's legacy for those of you who know what it means to carry a person you love in the everyday choices you make long after they are gone. Victoria's story is not simply about a young woman walking into a high school hallway in a flight suit that doesn't quite fit her frame. It is about inheritance, the kind that never appears in any will. It is about the weight a parent's legacy places on a child's shoulders, the dignity in honoring that legacy quietly and without performance, and the particular courage it takes to be unapologetically yourself in a world that hasn't yet caught up to who you are. For those of you who have loved someone in uniform, a father, a mother, a child, a sibling, you already know how real that world is. The rituals, the discipline, the particular kind of grief that arrives when service and sacrifice converge in a single, defining moment. Victoria's choice to put on her father's flight suit on the anniversary of his death was not dramatic theater. It was one of the most human things a person can do, reaching for someone who has gone through the objects they left behind, pressing your hand against fabric that still carries their scent, wearing their name on your chest as if proximity to the letters could close the distance. I also wanted to write a story about the unexpected connections that find us when we are most out of place. Danny, who sees Victoria clearly from the very first conversation without needing her to prove anything. Colonel Harrison, who reads a name tape in a school hallway and understands everything it means. Dr. Stanton, who heard a legend from her wife and recognizes it still walking around in a younger woman's body. Even Brittany, who surprises herself by choosing decency over social advantage when it would have cost her very little to do otherwise. These moments, the stranger who understands, the adversary who becomes an ally, the teacher who knew your father, these are among the truest things I know about life. For those of you of a certain age, who have raised children and buried parents, who have watched the world change faster than felt comfortable, and who still carry the names of people who shaped you somewhere in the architecture of who you are, I hope Victoria's journey offered you something that felt like recognition. Not escape, but the particular comfort of being seen accurately. The reminder that duty and love are not opposites. That a promise made to a mother and an oath sworn to a nation can coexist, even when they pull in different directions. And that the most extraordinary people are often simply doing, with great care, exactly what they were raised to do. There is more of Victoria's story ahead. The device in her aircraft, the enemy who has not yet shown a face, the mission she did not request but cannot refuse, all of that waits. But I wanted to leave you here in this moment with her, seated at the head of a table she has earned, her father's call sign on the aircraft behind her, her purpose restored and clear. The work continues. It always does, for people like Victoria, for people like her father, for people like so many of you who gave years of your lives to something larger than yourselves, and who understand at a level that cannot be explained to those who haven't lived it what it means to still be in service long after the uniform is hung up, simply by the way you carry yourself through an ordinary day. Thank you for reading. Thank you for caring about a young woman who wears her father's name on her back and keeps his example somewhere in the center of her chest. Stories only matter because readers make them matter. With respect and genuine gratitude. The author,